Hello and welcome to a new edition of VLGA Connect, sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. It's a special episode this week. We'll be unpacking the results of the latest VLGA Councillor Census. I'm joined soon by VLGA President, Councillor Dr. Josh Fergeus, John Armitage from Qdos Research and Dawn Bray from the VLGA for a panel discussion on what the results are telling us and how they'll be used in a strategic roadmap for the future. But first, let's catch up on some of the latest sector happenings from around the state in Connect News. Darebin City Council has voted to cease flying international flags at its municipal buildings unless required by law, following a period of community consultation. The decision concludes more than 2 years of the Palestinian flag being displayed at Preston Town Hall and mandates that future flag removals be marked by a brief ceremony. An independent arbiter has issued a stern rebuke to 2 Moonee Valley councillors following a 5-month dispute that cost ratepayers $4,675. While no formal misconduct was found, the arbiter noted the inability of the 2 councillors to resolve the matter reflected poorly on the council. A community member has pleaded guilty to unlawful assault in the Ballarat Magistrates Court after throwing coffee at the Chief Executive of Hepburn Shire Council, Bradley Thomas. The council is now citing the legal outcome as a reason to call for stronger state and federal workplace protections for local government staff. After 3 votes across 2 meetings, Wyndham City Council has eventually elected Councillor Preet Singh as Mayor and Councillor Jasmine Hill as Deputy Mayor. That election follows a 1-month suspension of the former Mayor Josh Gilligan for misconduct, which had effectively vacated the office. Wyndham City Council has passed a motion to establish a more systematic process for releasing in-camera or confidential information to the public. The Chief Executive will prepare a report on how to make the release of past decisions more proactive, moving away from permanent confidentiality as a default. The City of Whittlesea has confirmed it will continue to operate its family daycare service and plans to expand the program by recruiting more educators. An independent review found that expanding the service would support local employment and ensure the program remains financially sustainable. Kingston Council is considering new governance rules that would require councillors to provide 3 signatories and credible references for any notice of motion. The proposal also includes expanded powers for the Chief Executive to reject motions that interfere with day-to-day operations or threaten the council's reputation. Mount Alexander Shire Council has passed a motion calling on the federal government to impose a climate pollution levy on fossil fuel corporations. The proposed funds would be used to help local governments recover from extreme weather events following a series of fires, floods and droughts in the region. Swan Hill Rural City Council is advocating for immediate financial grants and concessional loans for local farmers following a major rain event this month. Mayor Stuart King said while neighbouring Mildura has been declared eligible for relief, Swan Hill farmers are facing similar acute financial stress during their harvest. And Surf Coast Shire Council has officially reappointed Robin Seymour as Chief Executive Officer for a further 5-year term. Mayor Liz Patterson cited Ms Seymour's leadership on the council's tenure strategy as a key factor in ensuring administrative stability through to 2030. And that's Connect News for this week. Don't forget to keep up to date on what's happening around the sector, not just in Victoria, but around the nation. Listen to the local government news roundup, brought to you by the VLGA. It comes your way 3 times a week and it's available wherever you listen to podcasts. And now let's get on with this special edition of VLGA Connect, looking at the Councillor Census. We're going to take a deep dive into the 2025 Victorian Councillor Census today. It's the 2nd year of a landmark commitment by the VLGA to track the demographics and attitudes of our local leaders on an annual basis. With over half of Victoria's councillors participating, we have a statistically powerful representative sample of the sector here. We're going to move between the data today with our guests. We'll talk about the human experience on the ground and the strategic roadmap for the future. Joining us is Councillor Dr. Josh Fergeus, President of the VLGA. Hello, Josh.
Hi, Chris. Good to be here.
Good to have you here. John Armitage is here from Qdos Research, who've run this census for the last couple of years. Hello, John, and welcome.
G'day. Thanks, Chris.
Good to see you too. And Dawn Bray, lovely to have you. First time on VLGA Connect, the head of local government programs and policy at the VLGA. Welcome.
Yes, hello, Chris, and hello, everyone. Do you have a jingle for like the first time caller, or like the ABC does?
But maybe we'll make a note of that for next time. That's a nice idea. But yeah, good to have you here. And you'll, of course, be telling us what's going to happen with this data as we move forward in the months ahead. But perhaps, John, if I could start with you, with the foundation here, you've noted a 50% engagement rate, which is exceptionally strong. From a data perspective, what does the average Victorian councillor look like right now, and how does their workload compare to a standard professional role?
Well, Chris, the average age is 54. That sounds a bit old if we're looking at the average age, but in fact, if the average age of adults in Victoria is 47, and the reason that it's a bit higher is mainly driven by an underrepresentation of people under 30. There's likewise a little bit of an underrepresentation over 70, and a bit boosted 40s, 50s and 60s. Look, maybe that isn't a problem, but people in their 30s were a bit under as well. So I think that's probably something to think about for who we encourage in the future. And yeah, the average hours councillor is putting into this job is 39 hours a week. And, some of them have got a full-time job. They're a bit less, more like 35. And what an astonishing amount of work to be putting in, basically. Doubling your day job there.
Yeah. So how many of our councillors are juggling those external employment responsibilities as well?
So most people have got something else. About 1/3 were full-time employed, similar number for part-time, and also quite a lot of people self-employed. There's also a relatively smaller group, but still significant number of people who were retired. They were averaging about 5 hours more on it, but I guess they've got the time to do that. So a lot of people are working full-time, self-employed or part-time, vast majority.
Just as an aside, John, because I know you've been around the sector for a long time, if we'd taken this snapshot 20 years or so ago, would my gut feel be right that we would have had a much older cohort of councillors than we have now in terms of average ages?
Yeah, I haven't got the data on that, but it certainly, if you initially look at that 54 and think as an average that is old, in fact, unplug it a bit, it's actually not too far off. I suspect that probably is the case. It is a bit different. And I suspect, I haven't probably got big enough numbers for me to be too conclusive about it, but I suspect particularly in the metro area, we're getting a larger number of younger people getting elected.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So, John's just described for us a group of people who are essentially working two full-time jobs when you think about that 39-hour commitment. And the census shows that while returning councillors are adjusting to a changing governance environment, new councillors are hitting a wall of deep frustration with the demanding nature of the role. Does that match your feel for what's happening out there?
Yeah, it does. And look, as one of those people who would be in that group of essentially, taking on that much work, it's a lot to get your head around. I think particularly for new councillors coming on board who are now in single member wards, which, a lot of new councillors in previous wards, some would have had that experience, but certainly not as many as we're seeing now. There is an intense feeling for a lot of those people of responsibility to represent, their particular constituency. They are the go-to person for, sometimes tens of thousands of people, and it's a lot of pressure. And I think for someone who hasn't had that sort of public-facing experience before in their work, and that will be most of us coming into the role, or almost all of us. It's a lot to try and tackle with, and then you have to weigh up, well, what the Local Government Act tells you about your role, what might be expected in your code of conduct, versus that sort of pull and immediacy of residents just in your patch, representing your patch, versus the council and community as a whole, which we're expected to do, and reckoning with the fact that, well, if they want to do this for another term or seek re-election, they're answerable to different groups of people. On paper, it can be okay to deal with these things. And as we have more experience, we can sort of understand how to balance those. But for new people coming in, those new councillors who you referred to, Chris, that's a lot to get your head around. And the frustration they feel with the expectations, the sort of relentless expectations of the community, and the pace at which they're expected to come to terms with a pretty wide range of decisions they have to make as councillors, makes it extremely challenging. And all of this when they're trying to squeeze hours out of often already full lives. It's a lot.
Yeah, and you mentioned the single member wards there. Of course, that's a reasonably recent development, this push to more single member wards. So do we think that's heightening this tension, but when it comes to that localism that councillors are feeling the pressure to be on top of?
I think it's difficult because previously you might have had a situation where you had 3 or 4 councillors in a multi-member ward, for example. If you were a new councillor coming on, chances are you'd probably have someone more experienced within that ward. Now, you know, you might have ideological differences, you might have different views about what you want to get done, but you also have someone there who, one way or another, can model a way of working and an understanding of that local community and might give you a little bit of time to find your feet in your own role. I think, you know, that was certainly the case for me when I first started on council about 9 years ago. Even though, you know, the ideological differences and views were certainly there, I think having people who'd done it before, who'd found ways of working that you could look at and pick the bits you liked and pick the bits you didn't like was quite helpful. Whereas now, I think some councillors are finding themselves a bit more isolated. You know, there are issues which might just be relevant to their particular patch, and other councillors aren't really paying as much attention in the same way. They've got their own issues. So it does create a new set of problems, I think.
Yeah. Josh, we'll come back to you. I want to bring Dawn into the conversation. Dawn, we're hearing here about the workload and the frustration that councillors might be feeling constrained by the system. And the census has found that the induction training, it is valued, but many see it as too theoretical. How do you think the VLGA can respond in terms of its professional development offering to perhaps be more hands-on for these time-poor councillors?
Yeah, look, thanks, Chris. And that's a good question. Certainly, I came in the last 6 months of last year to the VLGA, and councillors were really time poor in terms of they were doing the budget, they were doing council plan, they were still getting used to their role, and they'd also done the induction program, plus they had to do year 1. So they essentially had to finish 2 programs in 1 year. And so we got a lot of feedback from people in terms of we have got the theory behind us and 1 year of practice, 1 year of actually doing the job through year 1. Year 2 is all about being practical, and some of those issues and some of those skills that we need to refine and develop in terms of things like effective debating, managing your own personal health and well-being, given all of the pressures and all of the toing and froing and being pulled in lots of different directions, those active listening skills. And so we're really excited in the next few days to release our CPD offer for year 2. And that will look at things like self-paced learning. We're using our Lunch and Learn program to do some self-paced learning, and also 1 hour online sessions to again reflect the time poor councillors that we have, but then also some 2-hour practical intensive sessions where it's all about role playing and doing some skill building then and there in terms of practical practice. So our CPD offer for this year will look very different, and I have to say we also have a broad range of new facilitators as well, 3 or 4 of which have also been councillors before and mayors before. So they bring those practical skills about what it is to be a councillor and mayor, and so they can offer some really practical solutions for councillors and relate to them. So,
yeah, so we're hearing a shift, I guess, to a more practical reality-based learning program there, which I'm sure will be welcomed. Thanks, Dawn. John, perhaps if we can come back to the data for a moment. There is a sobering statistic in here regarding safety. You found that 1/4 of male and half of female councillors have experienced bullying or non-sexual harassment from the public. How does this correlate, do you think, with a councillor's likelihood of running for re-election come 2028?
Yeah, it is a very serious problem. And as you noted there's a gender issue as well. I think I want to downgrade the negative experiences men are having, but it seems twice as likely that women are facing them. And reading their comments, it feels a bit nastier and often quite specifically gendered. So it's a problem for everyone in every council, but it's a more serious issue for female councillors. And I think, again, based on the comments, particularly younger female councillors seem to be the most likely to be in the firing line. It is most definitely having an impact on people. I think probably the most common thing they mentioned when we then asked, having experienced this, what impact did it have, is it really a lot of people talking about describing direct impacts on their mental health. Probably a quarter of people or something describing something like that quite clearly. And then quite a lot of comments too about how this is impacting on the functioning of council and even the impact on the functioning of democracy. I think probably the biggest volume of the problem is coming from outside council, where people can be on a social media group or just front you in public, and some people feel weary of going into public because of it. But there's also issues internal to council, be it a councillor or councillors that are, in the hurly-burly overstepping the mark. But I think also to some structural issues internally. It's a tricky thing for an organisation to manage. This is like the equivalent of the board. They've all got their legitimate right to be there. But also there probably is some work there to do in terms of the way that councils can manage these things internally. On your question about likely to stand again, perhaps the most stark response was overall councillors, despite all of this, are pretty likely to recommend the role to others. But if they've experienced this bullying harassment, about 60% of them would recommend it. If they haven't, about 80% would. So there's quite a stark difference. And we also get, as people have done more terms, they appear to be more resilient. Well, are they? Right. Or are the people that are copying it just getting out? So there's probably both factors going on there.
Yeah, interesting. And there also seems to be two groups. And I'll ask Josh's thoughts on this. While for some that abuse is leading to a breaking point, for others, they actually seem to be getting more determined for push for change. And we heard a bit about this at our Civility Day for Fast Track recently, Josh. As a leader in the sector, how do you think we protect the 65% who feel valued from being overshadowed by a culture of abuse?
Yeah, look, it's a really tricky question. I do think that there are clearly, and there remains, and I think there is growing, an issue in this space in the sector. And I think John's comments about it, women, and in particular younger women, being right in the firing line for that, I think is absolutely accurate in my experience. But it is all cohorts of councillors as well who are at risk. The frequency and severity of abuse might be varied depending on who you're talking about. But we do hear from state government, for example, that local government is valued and that the work of local councillors are valued. Very occasionally, we receive positive feedback from members of the community, and we know that as a sector we're valued. We know that we're trusted more than other levels of government and a lot of institutions in our society. But it is hard to hang on to that when you are in the midst of it, and when you are, you're a person who is out there doing your best as a councillor. There is not a lot of strong team work or team building or team feeling at a lot of councils. Some are lucky, and there are. You land with a group of personalities or a group of approaches or an alignment. But from what I hear from colleagues, even those that might have an ideological alignment or a party affiliation, they're not necessarily well supported by their colleagues. We don't do a good job of supporting each other, and we don't necessarily do a good job of modelling the behaviour that we want to see, but also communicating how valued the work of our peers and colleagues are. I'll try and go out of my way to text a colleague who I think has done a particularly good job. They've given a good interview, they've got a good outcome, they've responded in a good way to a resident. And I don't just mean at my council, I mean across across Victoria, because we don't hear that enough. And I think sometimes that can really make all the difference from people, because we know from this data as well, Chris, that people, despite how difficult it can get, there are a lot of people in this sector who are extremely committed to the role of a councillor and being the best councillor they can be.
Yeah. Look, you shared some of your personal experiences at Fast Track, and you've been a councillor for 9 years. Are you part of that cohort that John describes have just gotten more resilient over time? And is that something you've had to work at?
Look, I mean, perhaps I have gotten more resilient over time. It still hits hard depending on the day or the experience, but I suppose I'm still here. So perhaps I am getting into that cohort that, has found ways of dealing with it and processing it. I suppose for me, part of that really has been around trying to create some positive change in the sector, feeling like there are things that I can do around that, and there are responses to this challenge I can articulate which might assist other councillors or prospective councillors.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of things that Josh has said in terms of, and I also like to provide a country perspective, being from the country for the last 20 or 30 years. Look, it's more difficult sometimes for councillors in rural areas, particularly small rural councils, because you are at the heart of the community. When you go shopping, when you go to the footy, when you're dropping your kids off to school, you just can't escape it. People just see you as a councillor. And I suppose there's a little bit more anonymity to some extent in the metropolitan areas, but in the country areas, particularly small rurals, you don't have that anonymity. And so that ability to turn off or to not have that abuse or questions or sort of those face-to-face sort of contact is reduced. So I think rural councillors in particular also face those trials where they really can't turn off.
It's an experience that's also mirrored by many council CEOs, Dawn, between metro and rural areas.
And look, in staff as well. So staff and councillors as well. And the other thing, Joshua was talking about the team building. I suppose induction programs are very different now than they were a few elections ago. If I think about what I did, 10, 15 years ago, you used to start off with a big team building exercise, and you might have had a day or two just getting to know each other and understanding each other's styles. I think now, with all of the mandatory training, there's so much pressure to tick boxes and to get through a lot of content in a little period of time, that those sorts of things, the spending the time together, knowing each other socially, doesn't happen anymore, or doesn't happen to the extent that we need to do so. And I think even in year 2, we're doing we've already had a couple of team building sessions where councillors are really getting to know each other and to have those open conversations for the first time almost. And so I think there's something that we're missing in that first induction period around getting to know each other and understanding each other.
Important point, Dawn. And of course, during that COVID era, we had a whole cohort of new councillors that never had the opportunity to have that initial face-to-face getting to know you phase, didn't we?
And I think, Chris, that's sort of been the turning point in terms of that induction process, and also involving the executive members as well. So getting to know each other as a team. And I think there's sort of a breakdown between that relationship sometimes between the executive and the councillors as well, because you haven't had that time together to get to know each other at the very start.
So, Dawn, while you have the floor, we're talking about this culture of abuse and the impact that it's having. There's a specific budget bid that the VLGA wants to put to the state government on this here, isn't there? Can you walk us through the proposed mediation and EAP-style support services that the VLGA is proposing?
Yes, look, it also came out of the 2024 council census, and if you look at the report from 2024, we'll be basically saying the same things, because the results from this year's census really just echoes and reinforces those things. So it was around having an EAP or an employee assistance program style support mechanism for councillors when they need to have some additional professional support to help with some complex situation or some mental health and impacts that they often don't get that support through the councils, or they actually feel that the council's EAP program is not fully independent. And that is not true, but there seems to be a bit of a stigma around councillors using the EAP program. So we put to the government in the last budget bid, and also the one that's coming up, to do a trial for 12 months for a councillor EAP style program where we could have a panel of suppliers and just test how much it's used, and also the benefits and disbenefits of it. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect was also picking up this, I suppose, a theory of dealing with conflict or disillusionment or tension quickly, and having a panel of mediators that we would oversee, and trying to get mediators into councils quickly as soon as issues arise. And again, often having that external mediator, and this can also be outside of the internal dispute resolution process. It's really just an informal, get someone in, let's have a talk about it, build the skills. And again, we put in a budget bid for a 3-year trial around that, so we could actually track progress over a few years to see if that's something that makes meaningful outcomes.
Okay, we'll watch that one with interest. John, if I could come back to you, let's look at the family side of the data. 43% of councillors have children under 18 at home. And when you match that with the 39-hour work week that you mentioned earlier, what is the census telling us about those who are trying to balance young families and those returning to the role of councillor?
Well, goodness knows how they're doing it, but people with kids at home are still doing almost the 39 hours. I think they're averaging about 37 or something. So it's hardly any different. That's tricky, isn't it? There's a lot of things about a councillor's job that are quite time specific. The meetings are at this time, the different AGMs you've got to attend, etc., are quite time specific, and it's pretty time specific things with kids too, isn't there? Dropping them off to things, picking them up, and of course you've got to look after them if they're sick. So it's clearly a tough job. Look, that might be part of the reason we're underrepresenting people in their 30s. I think the average age of our first child is 29 or 30 in Victoria. So, and that the 30s are, well, 20s are underrepresented, but you sort of expect it, but 30s are a bit underrepresented. That might be related. I thought it was interesting looking at the different results between the first, second and 3+ terms. So a lot of new councillors this time. I think more than half turned over. That's about the proportions in our census as well. About half were first-term councillors. They're definitely with the differences you would have expected between first and second term. You're a bit more confident about things. You're a bit better at managing your time, etc. But those things really jumped up once you went 3 terms plus. So whether that's that you've the personality or circumstances you've been able to survive it, or whether you've in fact needed to either have or develop these sort of skills. But for example, things like being able to manage your time and separate tasks out, where people felt much more confident if they'd got to 3 terms. But 8 years is quite a long time to do something. So to kick on and do your 9th to 12th and so on, I think that was the thing that stood out to me, is that I think a lot of jobs you feel like you can get your head around it in the 4 years, but it seems like this job, people feel like they're mastering it probably more in their 3rd term and beyond.
Interesting. Josh, if I can come back to you, the census talks about how many councillors feel their ability to influence operational decisions is constrained. This has been around as long as I've been around the sector, that challenge in managing the strategic role and not so much straying into the operational as much. Has this been exacerbated, do you think, by the single-member ward system? Does that help or hinder?
I think it's been complicated by the single-member ward system. I mean, it takes a lot of skill and experience to know how to assert influence in the role of a councillor anyway. So given, we're seeing such large numbers of first-term councillors, we're a year and a bit into the term, you'd expect that to be developing. But what the single-member ward system does is it makes it a lot harder to work together with another group of councillors, whether that's 1, 2 or 3 colleagues towards a shared local aim, whether that's, you know, the way a service is delivered in your part of the community or local infrastructure or whatever it is, where you would have that sort of natural overlap with some things. It can be a lot harder to bring colleagues on board to support a particular change, and it's very hard for a lone councillor to sort of have that level of impact. But you know, that difference between the operational and the governance, the governance side of how a council runs. I mean, you know, often as a councillor, you will see how something is running operationally, and it is hard to see, particularly early on, the levers that you have to eventually achieve that outcome. And sometimes you have to be a councillor for 2 or 3 terms to see some of those things you put into place in your first term flow through. There are a lot of people out there who've done some very good work in their time as a councillor who, you know, weren't there to see the eventual benefits to the community. So it is a challenge, and I think, yeah, the single member ward system makes it a bit more difficult.
Yeah, if I could add a bit there, that we offer people a range of reasons like, what makes you feel constrained about being able to get things done? And not surprisingly, the top 2 were the state's rules and regulations. Often that, like, planning is a great example. You've got a very narrow window of decision making that you're allowed to make. And the other one, which is sort of obvious, was money. So both them were very high. But the next biggest category was a reluctance by either the administration or other councillors to embrace being willing to do something a little bit different. So the top 2 really were the top 2 and were the biggest barriers. But yeah, there's, to some extent, there was a bit of inertia that councillors felt was driving the inability to get things done.
Some more interesting findings to come out of this survey. Perhaps to wrap this up, Dawn, can we look ahead to the 2028 election cycle? How are the expansion of community leadership programs and things like the Mary Rogers Awards specifically designed to ensure that the next crop of candidates is more informed and more representative of the diverse communities they're seeking to serve?
Yes, I think they're the 2 key things, aren't they? That we really want to see councils that represent and look like the communities that they're representing. And I suppose in terms of getting that gender equality, that diversity, work backgrounds, disability backgrounds, educational backgrounds, all of those things, and even cultural backgrounds, we want councils to represent the people that they're standing and making decisions for. So in terms of the Mary Rogers Awards, we've committed to do that every year. So that's about focusing and showcasing women in leadership in local government. And we're running those awards again. I think nominations will be open in a couple of months for that, and we'll be delivering that in September. So I think that's really important in terms of giving people a platform, or giving women a platform, and also councils that are doing a lot to pursue and to focus on gender equity. And it's really good this year, again, having that rural focus. We're actually introducing a rural category for rural councils. Often they have very little resource and little money to do all of their gender equity work. And so we want to recognise the rural councils, which often have to do a heck of a lot of work on a smell of an oily rag. So we've got a new category this year. And in terms of the community leadership programs, look, we were doing one with Whittlesea last year, and look, we really want to push those to try and get those leadership qualities and also the understanding of what it means to be a councillor, what the pressures are, and trying to develop those resilience tools so that people know what being a councillor is like when they walk through the door. I think the mandatory training that councillors had to do in the lead up to the 2024 election was a good start, but I think there's a lot more that can be done, particularly around, things like the time commitment. I think in the mandatory training it was talking about 20 hours, and now we've seen very clearly that it can be double that. So those community leadership programs are really just trying to tap into those emerging leaders and to try and get that civic leadership skill developed within our communities.
Terrific. Thanks, Dawn. Josh, as president of the VLGA, perhaps if I can give you the final word, was there anything, now that you've got 2 years of data here with the census, that's jumped out at you that might be particularly surprising, perhaps, or confirming what you already thought?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably the latter, really, Chris. We've seen remarkably consistent sort of issues coming through, and we do have a new councillor cohort. I think what it says to me and what it says to the VLGA is that we've been talking about some of these issues the last few years. I don't think they're going away, and I think it requires a stronger response.
Terrific. All right. Well, the census for this time around, the 2025 VLGA Victorian Councillor Census, pretty much tells us we've got a deeply committed and highly engaged cohort of councillors, yet they're battling significant time pressures and unacceptable, you'd have to say, levels of public harassment. Through the annual tracking and the new support frameworks discussed today, the VLGA is ensuring that the data doesn't just sit on a shelf, but drives the practical changes that our local leaders deserve. Dr. Josh Fergeus, John Armitage, Dawn Bray, thank you all for your insights on today's discussion.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, bye-bye.
And that's our special edition of VLGA Connect on the 2025 VLGA Victorian Councillor Census.